Well, the book is a work of literary criticism, and it focuses on World War I novels written by both British and American citizens, and it explores the terrain of shell-shock discourses as they circulated in not only the World War I period itself, but also in the aftermath across the 1920s and the 1930s. Well, throughout the book, I'm hoping that the reader will principally learn about the novels themselves. The World War I novels are the principal objects of scrutiny for the book, so I'm hoping that my readings of the novels will kind of deepen and make more complicated the reader's understanding of those novels. But of course, I'm also hoping that the reader will take away a deeper understanding of what shell-shock meant at the time. Shell-shock was this really complicated and much contested matter. It meant not only a kind of set of physical and sort of psychic experiences for individual sufferers, but it also meant a great deal to the communities that tried to welcome them back home. It meant a great deal in terms of the political implications of who would get a pension and who wouldn't. And so the book kind of consistently asks the reader to think about questions about who we remember when we think about World War I and those who suffered in World War I. And then, of course, the book also emphasizes the fact that when we remember certain folks, there are also other constituencies that kind of go by the wayside. In other words, processes of remembering run alongside of processes of forgetting. So the book draws our attention, I think, to some underserved and underreported World War I stories, such as, for instance, the story of African American service and suffering in World War I, and of course, shell shock. Well, I wrote the book principally because I felt like it needed to be written. That's kind of a cliche, I realize, but in the field of World War I literary studies, much attention in the past has been given over to poetry and memoir as the chief genres representing the story of shell shock, but I felt that novels as a collective really deserved some extra scrutiny, so I put the book together in a way to respond to that gap in my field. But I also fell in love with the writing of modernists like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Ford, as a kid. And I knew when I went back to grad school that I really wanted to build their writing into my project. And then I think the third impulse derives out of my Canadian heritage. I'm a Canadian citizen. And back home, World War I has a really big part of the collective consciousness. And when I first moved to the US to do my undergrad, I was a little bit surprised to find that Americans didn't really seem to be talking about World War I, didn't seem to know much about it. Sort of functioned in a way for me as a kind of forgotten war down here. So the book, in a way, sort of responds as well to that kind of gap. And I hope it resonates for not only Americans, of course, but also Canadians back home and for citizens over in the UK. So the process of writing this book was a kind of a long labor of love sort of endeavor. It started as my dissertation project for my PhD, which I did at Boston College. And I decided early on I wanted to focus on World War I. And experiences of wounding. It wasn't until after I got the degree itself and was out in the field working at Wake Forest, as it happens, where the idea for the book really came together. And I realized that at its heart, this was going to be a project about shell shock, and I needed to add some components to the dissertation project. One of the moves that the book makes, that the dissertation project only really got started on, was to look at the impress of race in discourses about shell shock. So the questions that I was asking in the dissertation project about African American service in World War I conjured up questions for me about the relative whiteness of the accounting of shell shock in the British story of World War I, which brought me to the story of India. Indian soldiers served in big numbers in World War I, and this, like the African American story on the American side, the story of India's service in World War I is, I think, an underreported one. And certainly, if the story of Indian service and sacrifice in World War I is underreported, the story of Indian shell shock is like an obscurity within an obscurity. So when I added the piece about India, the book suddenly had a kind of first half and a second half. The first half takes up kind of broader discourses about shell shock at the time, and then makes a shift to thinking about identity and the impress of identity politics at the time and now on the historical record with regard to shell shock. Well, shell shock relates to modern PTSD in this really complicated and interesting way. There's all sorts of common ground that shell shock then and PTSD now share. And I think my study, moves back and forth between the World War I era and our own, kind of taking up how shell shock was conceived and theorized then, and drawing analogies to how PTSD is theorized and conceived of now, while at the same time acknowledging that these are While there's overlap, there are also important differences. These are historically situated entities that can't be sort of described in a totally apples to apples kind of way.